Let us explore now the factors influencing the direction of the Russia-China relationship. The title of the panel is Russia and China, Coupling or Decoupling Towards Friendship or Strategic Subjugation. Our guests for this topic are, in ABC order, Konstantin Eggert, honored by the Queen of England as member of the Order of the British Empire, a former head of the Moscow office of the BBC, currently a Russian affairs analyst and a program host at Deutsche Welle. Anthony Kim, a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, a research fellow in economic freedom and the editor of the Index of Economic Freedom, and he's also a manager of global engagement for the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Good to have you. Tamás Matura, a professor at Corvinus University, widely acknowledged for his outstanding expertise in China, history, current affairs and all. I'm biased, I've interviewed him 1,000 times. He's also the founder of the Central and Eastern European Center for Asian Studies at Budapest. And our moderator is Giorgio Cella, a foreign policy analyst at the Matura Foundation. One of his main areas of expertise are Central and Eastern European and Russian geopolitics. He's the author of a book on the history and geopolitics of the Ukrainian crisis. Good to have you. And if you allow me just one personal comment, I'm honored to have you with us, Mr. Eggert, because it's the first time for me, as a broadcaster and a former current affairs analyst, to meet someone who was actually a colleague, a broadcaster for TV Deutsche, for TV Rain.
Good evening to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here in Budapest. And I want to thank the organization Equilibrium Institute for inviting me over, especially to the ambassador Székely, especially for her trusting in my moderating capabilities, since it's the first time I do moderate a panel. I also wrote them in our previous emails exchange, probably sending them a shiver down their spines, but I hope I'm not gonna bring any disruption to the conference. So we are here, jokes aside, to talk about one of the most important and crucial aspects of the 21st century geopolitics, which is the Sino-Russian relations. It's something that has a great impact on all of our lives, our states, both hemispheres of the European Union, the Mediterranean country, the northern countries, also in the Indo-Pacific hemisphere. It's one of, I would say, the most challenging, worrying and compelling geopolitical trends that is reshaping the international landscape. And today we will go through its many dimensions and also its evolution, if possible, and we will also look at possible outcomes and outlooks on the future of this on this crucial new partnership. And we will do it with this very distinguished panel. And I would like to start our conversation by asking an open question to all of you. Concerning the very nature of the Sino-Russian relations. We have been hearing a lot at the think tank levels, also within NATO, about the real nature and structure of this partnership, whether it's an alliance by convenience, or if it's a temporary alignment, or if it's transforming into a solid and strong strategic partnership. While we are talking today, besides the war in Ukraine that is going on after 2.5 years, as everybody know. There is military drills right now in the close to Japan in the Sea of Okhotsk between Russian and China, by the way. So we couldn't get a more timely day to start the conversation. So I would start by my right with Tamás. Please, also given your background on Chinese foreign policy, guide us through what are your reflections and thoughts about the very nature of this relationship. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Thank you, Ambassador, for inviting me again, I think for the second or third time. I really appreciate this opportunity. So when it comes to the Chinese-Russian relationship, I think the fundamental question is, are we going to see a Chinese-Russian military alliance? Because, that's the elephant in the room. A lot of people have been talking about it. And I'm a university guy, so what I can share is some thoughts, what literature says on this topic. And according to the literature, there have been some very interesting research on what kind of leaders, what kind of countries engage in a real military full-scale alliance. And literature says that those leaders or those countries tend to engage in such a relationship that have a similar way of thinking, similar thoughts about how the world should look like, or what are the main characteristics of the international relations. And therefore, no surprise that there is such a long-standing alliance between Western countries, Western liberal democracies. And a lot of people, but I think it's a kind of a shallow way of thinking, a lot of people would expect that, okay, Russia, China, axis of the evil, they are all the same. They would engage in such a military alliance sooner or later. But in reality, if we dig a little bit deeper, what the Russians and what the Chinese think about how the world should look like and how the system of international relations should work, there are very substantial differences over there. I think most of you would agree that while Russia is obviously a revisionist power that wants to burn the world, if you like, let me exaggerate a little bit, or at least burn the international system built by the United States, China has a very, very different attitude. And China has been engaging in a very different endeavor in the past 30, 40 years. China doesn't want to destroy the system. As we know, China wants to take it over from the inside, which, by the way, is a way more dangerous because it's really hard to detect it sometimes. And the Chinese way of taking over these institutions, I think it's more it's a shrewd and sly approach compared to the Russian, which is very, very obvious. So all in all, we don't expect, at least in the foreseeable future, a very obvious military alliance between Russia and China. Not only because China has a doctrine that it doesn't engage in military alliances, you can change your doctrine, but also because the Chinese are very smart, and I don't think that they want to bind their hands in a military relationship. Or I think if you just ask yourself, the Russia you see today, is it a country you would marry? You would start a very strong and binding relationship with? I don't think the Chinese would do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anthony, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So nice to be back in Budapest. So thanks to Equilibrium Institute and NATO PDD, of course, REC Ambassador, thanks for putting together this timely conference. So my approach is a bit different, not because we are not agreeing, but just a different approach. I'm from Washington, D.C., so allow me to share a bit of a Washington perspective. Maybe I shouldn't say that, maybe my perspective as a person in Washington. Let me set up a few conversational kind of backgrounds here. So this particular session, and then the title of this conference is BEST, Budapest Energy and Security Talks. I'm trained as an economist, and maybe because of that, I see this whole conference from a prism of economic security, especially in this era of, interplay of geopolitics, conflicts, all the economic issues we are facing. And somebody mentioned already, maybe Giorgio, at the beginning of our opening remarks, let me remind you, this is the 21st century, right? So this is a very different environment. And why do I say this is an economic security dimension? Again, like take a half step back at least. In May, Russia, something happened. What was that? Putin replaced defense minister from military guy to a new guy, completely different guy. He never spent a single day in army barrack. But he had at least uniform. But this guy, Andrei, he's an economist. So he has a view on the economy from a statist perspective, big government policy. And his last job before he became defense minister was minister for economic development. How interesting. So my thinking is that Putin, he may see the whole thing not necessarily through conventional security dimension. Definitely there's something about economic security dimension. Now, fast forward to today, this week. What's been happening in Washington is very interesting. This is something called China Week. In Congress, especially House, they are trying to push forward all the China-related legislations this week. It's not going to be, become a law, but the law of the land, but it's a very symbolic push. So if you look into those, Speaker Johnson's legislative agenda, all about economic dimensions. So what I want to emphasize that I think our conversation here, especially when it comes down to China and Russia dimension, I think we should think about geoeconomics. Of course, geopolitics is very important, but in reality, what's been unfolding is, in my view, it's a geoeconomic competition, geoeconomic chessboard that is much more complicated, multidimensional, and elevated. To me, it's not about decoupling or coupling or subjugation. To me, Russia-China relationship, nothing new. To me, it's a friends with benefits. It's a friends with a lot of benefits. If you look up, just in case, friends with the benefits in American language slang, it is kind of special tone. Not just friends, but casual, regular, something special. So my point is very simple. This is not a new movie you are watching. This time, it happens to be a bit unique because Russia is more desperate than China, because China has an economic power. Last point, we've been guessing, we've been thinking, we have been aware in a way how much China has been helping Russia. Obvious, so obvious, substantially. By helping Russia as much as they can, China has been getting all the things they needed in terms of military technology. Again, we have known this. Now, surprise, surprise, there was a public statement by somebody in Washington very high. His name is Kurt Campbell. He's number 2 at the State Department. Just in case you don't know about this guy, Kurt Campbell, great scholar, great policymaker, although he's a Democrat. Just kidding. He spent a lot of time in Washington really as a special, very well-informed policymaker. I truly respect him. He used to be with the DOD, Foggy Bottom State Department. You remember the pivot to Asia under Clinton era? Dr. Campbell was one of them who architected the whole notion and whole approach, pivot to Asia. This week, he had a very close meeting with the NATO allies, and then he had a public conference, press conference, and there he said specifically, what I said, China-Russia relationship. China has been very substantially helping Russia, and in return, China has been getting military technology concerning submarine, naval power-related technologies. So if number 2 at the State Department publicly stating this very symbolic message and powerful message, and basically let them know, China and Russia, we are watching you and we know what you guys are doing. So this is not anything secret. My final point will be, Xi Jinping will be visiting Moscow next month for BRICS Summit. How convenient, October, just right before November 5, US election. So there are a lot of moving pieces in the space of geoeconomics. In my view, once again, China-Russia relationship is friends with a lot of benefits, and obviously Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, for giving this first reflection, also especially from the Washington perspective. And now, Konstantin, we were talking before the conference about also your mixed origins. You have lived in Russia for a lot of times. And when we talk about this relation, also the cultural aspect is important. We know that average Chinese and an average Russians are almost like 180 from each other. It's a completely different worldview, different sociological aspects, different tradition, and so on and so forth. We have the authoritarian common ground, which is also that could be dissected into its pretty different styles between Russia and the Chinese. They are both former empires, and they are building over a narrative which takes back this imperial aura. And so I would like to put all these elements together while keeping the focus on our first topic about the very nature of this alliance or alignment, please.
Thanks a million. And by the way, you already delivered parts of my remarks. So like in the old joke about Pope John Paul, for me, just a cup of coffee. Before we proceed, I just don't want to leave the former defense minister Shoigu alone. Mr. Kim, he's no military. Actually, I'm more military than he is. At least I did my 3 years of national service. He wore a lot of uniforms, which he invented for his previous ministry, which was the emergencies ministry. And you can imagine he was a very busy man, because Russia is a country of permanent emergencies. But he had nothing to do with defense organization. He was a successful manager in some way, but frankly speaking, whatever Russian military possesses today in terms of, you can call military prowess, is very much due not to him, but to his predecessors. But that's an aside. Regarding China, I'm not an academic, I'm not even a China specialist. When I could live and travel in Russia, I traveled in the Russian Far East. I'm a journalist, so I will be speaking maybe in slightly different terms. Andrea, you mentioned one very important thing. What links these countries together? Both are dictatorships. They're different dictatorships, but they're dictatorships. That's an important element. Number two, you mentioned empires. I would deepen it. Yes, it's two countries with deep inferiority complexes, which on top are obsessed with the United States of America. For Putin, the sun rises and sets in Washington, D.C., metaphorically speaking. So the same, I think, goes to some extent for the Chinese leadership, albeit in a slightly different manner. Number three, both countries, I think, at least both countries' leaderships, understand that they have societies and demographics that are deeply flawed. These two countries are in extreme demographic danger in a different way. In China as a result of one-child policy, in Russia because of essentially a very simple fact. Russia is a dying country and nothing can stop it, or very few things can stop it. I think that for the Russian regime, this is, of course, very much a marriage of convenience. You're right. It is a very important element in playing up Russia's role in the world within the context of these pseudo alliances like BRICS and stuff like that, because it is one way of, again, I'm sorry to use the expression, showing a middle finger to the United States without paying too much of a price. And I think that you're quite right. Technology transfers from Russia to China, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, were huge. By now, I think it's rather more, should be rather more of a reverse element. Russia is technologically inferior. And coming back to what was said in previous sessions, if you look at the defense budgets, Russian officially is around about 90 billion, and it is 4.1, 4.2 of the GDP. The Chinese is nearly 300 billion, and it is 1.7 of the GDP. Feel the difference. I think that for Putin, to some extent, Putin, I don't think he romanticizes China. He understands that it is a marriage of convenience. But I think for him, what we've seen in the last, especially 2.5 years since the aggression against Ukraine, and increasingly, Russia was becoming increasingly a junior partner to China. In the last 2.5 years, this process speeded up, and by now we can talk about real dependence.
A complete inversion of the Cold War era,
yes,
right?
Absolutely, and also which came as a complete surprise to the Russians that used to treat the Chinese as some kind of, peasants that don't know nothing, haven't driven an automobile in their life, around about 20 years ago. By now, it is a dependence which basically is crucial, because if you look at the Chinese imports of Russian gas with a huge discount, up to 35%, it is a vital part of financing the war economy. I think, and I want to leave demographics aside because that's a very colorful picture, but I think for now, one thing I want to say is we are coming close to a situation which Putin tried to avoid, the Putin regime tried to avoid for a long time. For a long time, Putin did not want to let the Chinese into basically the management and whatever passes for shareholding in big Russian state enterprises. But the Chinese in 2014, 2015, after the annexation of Crimea, said, by the way, you're in a slight technological bind, we'll give you free our high-speed train technology in exchange for 10% of Russian railways and a seat on the board of directors. Putin said no, because he didn't want to let them into the holy of holies of his regime. I think, and that's the last thing I'm saying, now we are probably coming to a situation where the Chinese will be able to make Putin an offer that he will not be able to refuse in this or that way concerning the heart of the Russian economy.
Konstantin, I will have one more question to you, because it comes from the audience, from Reika. I don't know which Reika, maybe. What is the situation at Russia's eastern borders, since you've also traveled there and stuff? Are the news about creeping Chinese taking off lands and building settlements there true? If you could tell us something about that, and then we will get back to Europe.
Look, I really wanted to leave it for later, but okay. Demographics is a big issue. Russia, without occupied territories of Ukraine, is about 140 million people. 138, official. Now you imagine the map. About 110, if not 115 million of these 140, and that I'm giving a very optimistic estimate, live to the west of the Urals mountains. Only 25 million officially, according to some independent assessment, and what you see when you travel there. Last time I was there, well, a long time ago, but still a few years. Maybe it is even closer to 15 million, all the way from the Urals to the Sakhalin island. Now, the most maybe visible element of Chinese small business penetration of Russia is the fact that 10 years ago, when you went to Vladivostok, which is 600,000 people, one of the biggest cities in the Russian Far East, I think second biggest. Well, it was, okay, Russian-speaking, fairly European-looking city, which just happened to be in Asia. When I came there, maybe it was before COVID, I thought, interesting. It's like Shanghai in 1927, half of it is Chinese. Well, at least it looked like that. You already had huge Chinese quarters there. I mean, restaurants where no one spoke any language but the Chinese and so on. I'm not saying that's bad, but it's strange. And it's so quick.
It's the future of the Russian Far East,
yes,
probably.
also the issue is, now we have to go to Russian demographics. Russia's a dying country. Russian men will die earlier than Russian women. Russian male average life expectancy is 37. For women, it's 42 to 43. Alcoholism, AIDS, you name it. 10 top diseases are there. Maybe apart from cholera. What do you have? You have Chinese people, Chinese men coming across the border to work as agricultural laborers, then just businessmen and so forth. There is a lot of intermarriage because there are not enough Russian men, and Chinese men do not drink, bring the money home, don't beat their wives. Lots of stuff in culture that are different. They don't go to jail every 3 years. That's an important element. Including for, let's put it like that, physical relationship. So what happens is that you have an increasing number of people that are already members of councils in Russian small towns, mayors of villages, and so on and so forth. Is it bad in itself? No. But demographics are, to a large extent, basically, it's a fate, it's a future. And if you look at the Chinese textbooks, and I'm sure that there are China specialists here that know better about it, but it's very clear that although the demarcation of the border, which happened in 2007, I think, between Russia and China, is not put in doubt officially, but essentially Chinese textbooks tell the children and then students that about 1 million square kilometers of Russian territory was illegally, or rather taken away from China when China was very weak and subject to imperial aggression, especially under, I think, Simonoseki, a treaty of 1861 or 63, I forgot. So, in a sense, it's not revisionism, but it's kind of revisionism by stealth. And, you know, while you have, I don't know, an MP in Estonia saying, by the way, do you remember this Tartu Treaty from 1920? Well, we have to do something about it. Russian propaganda goes into overdrive saying that Estonia wants to invade Russia. But when the Chinese officials speak about, you know, this imperial past that should be corrected, no one says a word in Moscow. That also, I think, is an illustration of this inequality. Sorry for speaking so long.
Thank you, Konstantin. Now I would like to get back to the European hemisphere, and we cannot avoid talking about the war in Ukraine. I would like to know from you, Tamás, first, how is the war in Ukraine affecting these Sino-Russian relations? And we have also seen a transformed balance of power within Europe. We have seen France and especially Germany losing a lot from this war in terms of economical power, economical wealth, both with Russia. We all know about the Nord Stream 2, what happened, and also in terms of the relations with the wider commercial relations with Russia. So now we have seen the French and German government trying to redress their foreign policy towards a more robust relation with China. Would you tell us a bit more about how the war in Ukraine is affecting the European Union and especially Germany and French relation towards China?
Right, thank you. I think to understand this, we have to get back to the previous question a bit, whether this Chinese-Russian relationship is a marriage of convenience or friends with benefits, definitely strings no attached version of that. I think the right expression would be it's a marriage of necessity. So it's not convenient. The Chinese don't like the Russians don't like the Chinese either. They don't trust each other. The Chinese have a very long list of potential problems with Russia, but it's kind of necessary them to work together. And to understand that there is a very simple way to depict it. Imagine a decision-making matrix. We have two columns from the Chinese perspective. Option number A, or option A, we, the Chinese, we keep helping the Russians. Option number B, we, the Chinese, we stop helping the Russians. And when it comes to the two horizontal rows, from the Chinese perspective, how does Russia react to that, and how does the United States react to that? And if you fill in the brackets, what you get there, that the Chinese have no better option than keep helping Russia. Because, okay, let's imagine the Chinese stop helping Russia. How would the Russians react? They have a 4,000 miles long common border with a very problematic history, a nuclear power that is a huge source of natural resources. The Chinese don't want to have an enemy in their backyard. Again, by the way, how would the United States react should China stop helping Russia? Would the United States suddenly realize that China is the best buddy forever and stop, building a global coalition against the Chinese? No, that would be practically irrelevant, at least in the long run. So what if we keep helping the Russians from the Chinese perspective? The Russians love us. The Russians offer us oil, not very enthusiastically, at a huge discount. My Russia expert friends, they keep telling me that the Chinese are cruel to the Russians. So the Chinese keep pushing the Russians and they squeeze the last drop of kopeka out of the Russians, or cents or barrels of oil whatsoever. And the United States, well, the United States hates us even more, but the difference is not that big compared to stop helping the Russians. So this is practically the Pareto optimal solution or choice for the Chinese. It's not necessarily, the Chinese are not necessarily very enthusiastic about it, because it comes at a cost. And the cost is, by the way, China's relationship to the EU, especially to Central Europe. I don't know whether you still remember the famous or infamous 16+1 cooperation. Haven't heard about that for 3 years. With the exception of Hungary, most of the Central and Eastern European countries have totally not only abandoned their China policy, but made a 180-degree turnaround. Poland, the Baltic states, even Romania in a very Romanian subtle way, but they turned their back on on China, and of course on Russia at the same time. So China has lost a lot in Europe. And getting back to Germany and France and their changing attitude towards China, I think if I can put myself for a moment, if I was someone from Washington, I can imagine that from the Washington's perspective, the change is very, very slow, but it has at least started. So that the French and the Germans started to look at China as a problem, as an issue. And America, has been pushing Europe and Brussels towards this direction. But since Europe doesn't really take China as an existential threat, this kind of attitude in Europe Europe was very reluctant in turning against China. And this has changed because of China's implicit support to Russia. And especially in Germany, because everyone will follow Germany eventually. In Germany, this kind of de-risking process has already started. Now they are, at least for a year, they've been looking into their trade figures, and they are trying to literally investigate every single item of German imports from China. They have identified around 800 articles. Where Germany's dependency on China is over 50%. So that's tragic practically. Out of the 800, they kind of excluded 500 articles where they found out that, okay, our dependence on China is over 50%, but who cares? So, I don't want to exaggerate, but if China stops exporting socks to Germany, the German economy would survive. But the remaining 300 articles, including raw materials, including chemical products, including electronic stuff, are the things where the Germans are super dependent. So in a very German way, they have started to think about it, how to redistribute our imports, how to filter out the Chinese, how to find alternative sources. And this process is going on. I'm not sure that it's feasible, so to get totally detached from the Chinese economy, but it has already started. And if the Germans have started that, other European countries will follow suit. The only thing is that Germany alone is responsible for 1/3 of EU-China trade, so everyone else is much, much smaller, and the Germans are the most important, but they are doing it. They have been doing that for a year at least, so I think this is the future for the other European countries as well.
Thank you, Tamás, for this articulated answer. Now you just pretended to be a guy from Washington. We have a real guy from Washington here, so I would like Anthony to tell us more about this, about how the geopolitical pervasive presence of China in Europe and this new attempt from the two pillars of the European Union, which is, of course, France and Germany. I have to say, although I'm Italian, I have to say the truth, at least from an economical and commercial point of view. How is Washington overseeing all of these movements, considering also the 16+1 initiative that Tamás has hinted about, and which turned into a kind of, let's not say practical failure, but something close to it, or it's at least diminishing its momentum, and also concerning all the discussion regarding the Belt Road Initiative and so on and so forth. Thank you.
We have a lot to unpack here. So, number one, I think things are working out to Beijing's advantage, 100%, no question about that, however we describe it. And also I want to point out, remember those years? Clinton 8 years, W. Bush 8 years, Obama 8 years. During those total 24 years, we've been inviting Beijing and China. That's what Clinton did, making China as a member of WTO. Beijing desperately needed economic growth to have domestic stability and political stability for the leadership. Now W. Bush, Obama, 16 years. What Washington has been doing is something called strategic economic partnership. That was the game of the show. Meeting together, high-level delegation going to Beijing, high-level delegation from China coming to New York City, everywhere, handshake, nice meal, photo ops, great, China, wonderful. But what did we get? Things were working out at that time to Beijing's advantage. We were creating never seen before monster in a way, economic power. The illusion we had collectively, our European allies and Washington, somehow magically China will be adopting political and economic freedom like Korea and Japan did. But that was illusion. Because although we say, axis of evil, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, authoritarian regimes, but we cannot put them all together in the same basket. China, to me, is a collective leadership authoritarian. It's not Xi Jinping. It's a CCP, Beijing's core power, CCP. My big problem with China is with the official name, People's Republic of China. China is neither republic nor peoples. Russia is a one-man show, as we know. In and out, he knows how to handle information and intelligence. This is very different. North Korea, to me, it's a family business. The Kim Jong-un is trying to continue his father's big legacy. Iran is a theocracy. So we should keep in mind, we cannot really assume all these bad guys are the same in a way. No, they are completely different by structure, by their culture, by nature and intention. Now, I'm not here to defend Mr. President Trump. Obviously, I'm in Washington, I watch everything, but I give him big credit. In 2016, he was the first politician, as far as I can remember. Wait a minute, guys, our relationship with China is not right. We got to do something. We got to do something. He started with a trading relationship and all that, but he was the first politician. Well, he was never a politician, right? He was the first presidential candidate who said it. We got to review our relationship, okay? So I think that was actually right call. No matter how chaotic, turbulent it may have been, look where we are today. Now, I think we should keep in mind when it comes down to military dimension, China has been busy with growing its economy first, and second, then they started thinking about modernizing, upgrading their forces, but especially Army and Air Force. Because look at China. China is really, you mentioned, China's history is very humiliating history. A lot of internal fights and everything with neighbors too. So to them, army was the main thing. So they've been busy with, upgrading army, especially through their economic growth and development. That's why their military, civil dual usage of that kind of economy. But now all of a sudden, China is realizing we need a naval power. We need a naval power because if we want to do something against the United States, it's a really naval power. If we want to do something against Taiwan, it's a naval power. War in Ukraine is mainly army and air force, but potential conflict between Taiwan and China is a naval power. What China is getting from Russia is not typical usual suspects of bullets and machine guns and tanks, and China is well capable of making them. But they are lacking the capacity in building large ships, battleships, and especially submarine. That's what they're getting from Moscow nowadays. And that's a very good trade-off from China's perspective. Now, final point. I know we've been describing here this way and that way, but really, I think we're really on the same page. But to me, how we describe our adversity, especially multiple adversaries relationship. If we keep saying this is marriage of something and something, we're assuming that somehow they're committed to each other, whatever certain degree. But to me, China and Russia, they are not completely on the same page. They're just acting on their own national interest based on pure transactional relationship. They can walk away from each other anytime. But this time, they're having fun together because they are getting what they needed. That's why they are friends with the great benefits, in my view.
It's, Anthony, if I can say, it's also similar to the Turkish-Russian relations.
That's a completely different subject, but
yeah, I know, but in terms of transactional benefits, I think it's kind of similar. Anyway.
But now to your ultimate question, then, what in the European context? I think my view is that China is getting really a lot of fun because look at what's happening between China and Germany, China and France. Even this week, China and Spain. Spanish Prime Minister is visiting Beijing. One part of us, I'm talking about whole community, transatlantic community. Oh, we got to do something against Beijing and China. But somehow, Macron was visiting Beijing and getting all the a social media boost, like a big picture, and then we need China, Germany, for the benefit of its economic growth and all that, what's been happening there. And so I think we are really, in a way, on a net basis, we are helping China, knowingly or unknowingly. Countries like Lithuania, they got big hit because of the Taiwan issue and all that, but the big guys, in a way, maybe we're thinking too much, maybe we're still naive, maybe we're trying to do both ways. Maybe that's why we're saying it's a de-risking. It's not really about, against China. I get that, but I think that we have to be really realistic and practical, and that's why, once again, I emphasize the important dimension of geoeconomics in this part of our chapter.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Konstantin, if you could keep it under the 2 to 3 minutes because we have some more questions from the audience. What's your follow-up on this issue? Maybe if you could focus a bit more on the German foreign policy towards China, if you...
Well, I'm not a big specialist on German foreign policy, but what I can say, following up from Professor Kim...
No, it's just Anthony. There's no...
Okay. I work for a German organization. For me, you'll always be Professor, Doctor. Look, that's a very important observation. I live in Vilnius for the last 10 years. And believe me, in spite of living 16+1, I came from a city where trams run, people get salaries, the sky didn't fall on earth since Lithuania said goodbye to China. And I think that's an important element. I think that there, of course, the European Union helped a lot with the case being brought to the WTO. But yes, I think that you have to be bolder in assessing Chinese pernicious influence or dependencies which are crucial, as Tamás enumerated. Regarding two observations that Anthony made. A, we have to remember that also I have no skin in this, in this fight, but it was also the Republican administration that started supplying lethal weaponry to Ukraine in 2017. That's something we shouldn't forget. Another thing, assessing Russian-Chinese relationship, it's very important to we should disabuse ourselves from the notion that people in the Kremlin represent Russian national interest. CCP does, the way China it is today, it does represent, or it tries to work on Chinese national interest. I never thought I'm going to say it in the presence especially of Minister Yeltsin, who dealt with these guys. The Politburo of the late Soviet days represented the national interests of the Soviet Union as they were formulated at the time. Yes. Putin's regime, which is crucially different from the Soviet regime, because not only it rules Russia, it also happens to own it wholesale, do not represent national interests of Russia. It represents a survival interest of the regime. And that's a big, big, big difference. And that's a very important element in the whole China story. And I'm going to come to the end of my remarks, because I think this is what people in Beijing, probably better, realize. And what I think was the Chinese line with regard to Russia since the full-scale invasion is that, yes, we do not want Russia to lose this war, but we also do not want it to win it big time and Putin to invade the European Union and, make the Chinese economy suffer very, very strongly. But they do want Putin to stay in power, but weakened Putin. But Putin. Because, and that brings us back to what Ian Brzezinski said regarding the change in Russia. It's only a personal assessment. Personally, I think that when, rather than if, Putin suffers final defeat over Ukraine, the next Russian government will be very much inclined to say, we're not going to be a democracy, but we are not going to make trouble for you anymore, because we realize that it goes nowhere. And that's exactly what the Chinese do not want. They do not want a regime figure coming to the Kremlin and becoming kind of, Khrushchev probably is the best comparison, who will say, well, the way we need to mend fences with the West, we need our villas back, we need loans back, we need technology back. That's exactly what the Chinese, I think, do not want. They do not want the Russian semi-authoritarian regime to start facing the West, to become a kind of Russia-Pakistan type of thing. And I think that this is probably a very serious consideration in Peking.
Thanks, Anthony, even though you didn't manage to stay under the 2 minutes. But one question from the audience to Tamás, which is, I can ask anybody but you. What role, if any, does Hungary play in Sino-Russian relations and in their engagement in the West? Please, under 2 minutes as well. So that's...
I think everyone is very hungry, right? So in 6 minutes. Hungary and the Russian-Chinese relationship, nothing. So I think there is ambition. There is definitely ambition on the Hungarian government side to play a role in this relationship. But no, come on, Beijing and Moscow, they talk to each other easily. So I don't think they need the Hungarian government in any regard. But still, Hungary plays a role, obviously, in the EU-China relationship and also in the Russia-EU relationship. I'm not a Russia expert, so maybe the gentleman next to me can talk a bit about this Russian-EU nexus, but when it comes to the EU-China relationship, the Hungarian government definitely plays a role and has been playing a role. And we don't have time to go into the details, so let me just raise a not that theoretical question. That in the past 8 to 10 years, the Hungarian government has been very eager in helping certain level of Chinese interest in the EU. But actually, if you really look into the details, it turns out that most of these Hungarian gestures towards the Chinese government on the EU level were usually quite symbolic. So the Hungarian government never made a decision that would have cost a penny to the Germans. To put it very simple, most of these gestures were about, protecting Chinese interests regarding South China Sea, Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, political issues. You can translate it as a very, very cynical attitude of the Hungarian government or as a pragmatic approach based on your taste, whatever. But my question is that when China's economic role in Hungary was so marginal for 10 years and in the previous 10 years, and the Hungarian government was already ready to help the Chinese on the EU level. Now that China is getting super important to the Hungarian economy, it was the Prime Minister just a couple of days ago said that China is about to become the third or second or even third largest investor in the country. So now that China is getting so important to the Hungarian economy, and we shouldn't forget that we are taking the second, third, I don't know how many loans from China. So from now on, how eager the Hungarian government will be to help China's interest on the EU level.
Please, Anthony, you wanted to add something, I think.
Just very quickly, just less than 1 minute, just two things. One, Russia has 11 different time zones, right? So for Beijing, it's a huge headache. If Russia collapses all of a sudden, or if it goes through disorderly transition from Putin to somebody. So think about that dimension. It's a huge headache. And remember, early this year or late last year, somehow Russia allowed China to use Vladivostok for their neighbor power and shipment. That's a huge development in my eyes, because Vladivostok is a very important geographic location, not only for Korean Peninsula, but for Japan. If you look at, I never visited Vladivostok, by the way, but if you look at the economy there, it's basically Chinese economy. But now, Putin is allowing, hey, Russia, do you need another port? Here you go. Vladivostok, that's a huge, so neighbor power, that's what China is getting. Now, on your question, if I may, I think Hungary may want to consider additional option. I think number one, Hungary, I really respect, but I don't know all the details, but what I do know, Hungary people and policymakers, they want to have a greater, closer relationship with Washington and the United States. But somehow, over the past 4 to 5 years, things are going not well. Look at what we are facing here. I'm not going to get into all the details, right? So I think we should recognize that Hungary's desire and interest. We want to get closer to Washington, but they are not getting good enough reaction from Washington. So they still have to play out their foreign policy, Russia and China. They cannot ignore. But I want to suggest there's many countries in Asia other than China. I want to highlight at least better countries than China. Not because my last name is Kim. I'm not talking about North Korea. I'm talking about South Korea and Japan and Singapore. Maybe Taiwan too much, I recognize that. But Korea, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, why not? So that if you want to do real balance, real foreign policy, geo-economic, realist kind of game, or real actual policy pursuit, I really suggest that how we really embrace this dimension. Japan, South Korea, Singapore, for example. South Korea, as far as I understand, I heard that it's a #1 investor in Hungary, which is good. I think that, look at Poland-South Korea relationship. Look at Japan's relationship with many countries in the region. Look at 3 Seas initiative. Japan is now invited official observer status. So let's think big. And I think if we want to have real practical diplomacy, let's not limit ourselves to those usual typical suspects, if I may. So let's broaden our horizon, if I may. That's my humble suggestion to Budapest.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you also for being so timely. We have 10 seconds left, so tempus fugit irreparabile, as our Latin ancestor says. Please thank you so much for our speakers, and good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.